Well, hey there guys, and welcome back. This week's show marks the continuation of our workbench build. So sit back, grab yourself a snack, and let's check out building a traditional workbench, part 2. Well, something wasn't quite right there with the bandsaw. I'm not quite sure what, but we've got quite a bit of burning here. And it's not exactly the smoothest cut, and I'm not too impressed with that. I'm going to have to look into the bandsaw setup and see exactly what went wrong there. But some might say, well, it's only on the bottom. Who's going to flip the bench over and see it? But that's not the point, is it? So all I'm going to do is take this cabinet scraper and I'll just clean up the cut. And you can see there how nice of a job that does in cleaning that up. So I'll go ahead with this coarse cabinet scraper, and then I'll hit it with a fine one to give it a nice finish there, and then we're going to carry on. Well, there was a high spot right here in the middle, and I don't know why, but it just kind of bugged me. So I ended up getting out this number 4 plane that we refurbished there a few weeks back, and I put it to use, and it took it down nicely, and you know, we got some nice shavings out of it, and we're ready to go on now that we've got this straightened out. Well, the next thing we need to do is mark the mortises that are going to be receiving the tenons from our legs. And if you follow the print again in detail E, it tells us that the tenon starts at 2 1/4 inches from the end of the leg. So we're going to start off with marking that 2 1/4. As well, the tenon on this side is 2 inches long. So if it's in 2 1/4 plus 2 inches is 4 1/4. So we're going to go ahead and mark that as well. Now, all we need to do at this point now is transfer these marks from the side where we marked them onto the top of our on the top of our rail. So we'll just mark it like this right across, and what I like to do is I like to just double check and make sure that it is 2 inches, and it is. Now, so we've got our 2-inch tenon 2 1/4 inches in from the end, and the drawing shows that this tenon is 1.5 inches wide. So 1.5 inches wide, this is a 2.5 inch board, so we need to put a mark 1/2 inch in from either side, and we'll just do that here like that, and there is the marking for our tenon. Now as well, we need to have this at 1 5/8 inch deep. So for that, we will also put a mark on the side at 1 5/8 of an inch so that we know how deep it has to be. And what we're going to do with this is I'm going to bite away at the majority of the material with a Forstner bit, and then of course clean it up with a chisel all the way around. So this 1 5/8 mark on the side is nothing more than an indication as to where to set our drill press stop. And of course, once you get all of your holes done, to nibble away at the majority of the material, just going to take a flat chisel here and run it down each side to straighten this mortise up and give us a nice clean entrance for the tenon to mate with. Well, I've got this mortise pretty much finished up, and this one's well on its way, as are the rest of them. I don't want to go too gung-ho on these and get them exactly perfect, because once I cut the tenons on the legs, there's going to be some fine-tuning that's going to go into getting the fit nicely into these mortises. And I don't want to take out too much material if it's already a nice clean fit. So this one here, the way that this looks at this point in time, I'm going to call this done for now, and I'm going to move ahead and knock the corners out of the other mortises, and after that, well, we'll come back and see you. One of the great things about this project, and hopefully you guys have noticed, is there's a really great mix between power tools with the jointer and the table saw and the bandsaw, and then of course with the hand tools, with the cabinet scrapers and the chisels and the hand planes. There's a great mixture of both power and handwork, and really this is a great project, and we're going to be moving right along, trying to keep that theme going as we carry on throughout the build of a great mixture between power and hand tools. So we haven't cut the tenons on the legs yet, and kind of done that on purpose, simply because, truth be told, I'm beat. I need a bit of a break. But what we do have is a bunch of this 2 5/8 by 1 1/4 stock that we milled out, and we need some rail filler blocks. And I believe their final dimension is 2.5 by 2 7/16 by 8 3/4 long. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut 4 pieces of this at 10 inches long, and then laminate them in groups of 2. And then of course cut them down to their finished size, the same way we did with the rails and the legs, except these pieces are just a little shorter for the rail filler blocks. So I guess I'll go ahead and we'll take care of that. So we've got our 10-inch pieces cut, and we'll just get a little bit of this tight bond wood glue here. So spread a nice even coat of glue on there, getting it right to the edges. And once you get that done, just clamp them up, and we'll let them dry till tomorrow, when hopefully I'll have enough time to get out here and mill these down to their final size. And once again, with all the clamps on, we play the waiting game overnight to let this stuff dry up. Well, the glue up is dry on the rail extension blocks, and just like we did with the rails and the legs, we're going to take a flush plane, clean up the squeeze out, joint that one side, and then we're going to run it through the table saw and cut these down to 2 7/16. Now that'll make them 2.5 by 2 7/16. We'll cut their lengths. Now they're going to be a little proud at that 7/16 mark, but that's not to worry about. We're going to adjust that later on in the assembly stage. Well, the rail filler blocks are down to their 2 7/16 by 2.5. Now we need to cut them to their length, which is going to be 8 3/4 in this case. So I put a cross-cut blade in the saw, and I'm going to get out my miter fence, and we're going to go ahead and cut those. And while we've got it, we've got all of our legs already milled down from before to 2.5 by 2.5, but now we want to cut them to their dimension length. And in this case, 28 3/4 is that magic number. So we've already got the miter fence out, might as well cut those as well. Now the next pieces we need to mill are the stretchers, and that will be the lengths of board that go between the 2 leg assemblies. And for that, what we're going to need is a piece 1.5 inches thick, 5.5 inches wide and 46 5/8 long. Now we're going to need 2 of those, one for each side of the sets of legs. And that's a pretty beefy stretcher. So we're going to go ahead and mill it and cut it down to its size. Okay, let's just summarize briefly what we've got here so far. What we've got is 2 stretchers that we've cut to their final dimensions, and we've got some rail filler blocks, 2 of those. We've got 4 of these rails, of course, with our mortises cut in them, and we have our 4 2-inch by 2-inch legs. So the next thing that we really need to work on here will be cutting the tenons on the legs to fit into these mortises on the rails. As well, the legs will also have a mortise cut into them to receive a tenon that is being cut on these stretchers. But with all that being said, without getting too far into it now, why don't we start with the tenons on the legs. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to mark the tenons on the legs. And you can see here that we have 1.5 inches by a 2-inch tenon. And the 1.5 inch section will run parallel with the rails. Now I say that the 2-inch section of the tenon goes parallel with your rail. And it's quite obvious when you look at your mortise that you've cut here. However, the reason I'm pointing that out is if you have laminated like what I've done here, you really want to pay attention to the orientation of your leg, because there will be another mortise cut in the leg that will receive the tenon for our stretchers. So my suggestion would be to mark the mortise for the stretchers first. I don't want a mortise cut in this case for the stretcher in the middle of this lamination. I would rather it be through a solid piece of lumber here. So I'm going to mark the mortises for the stretcher first on the face of each one of these legs. Now you really want to pay attention here for what you're marking. Because the drawing, although it gives you measurements, you will have to add the distance of your tenon as well. So what we're going to do here is we're going to mark the center and the bottom and upper kind of limits of our mortise, and then we're going to take our square and we're just going to mark our lines across here like this. And our tenon is 1 inch wide. Now if we have 2.5, take away the inch of our tenon, that would give us 1.5 inches. Half of that is 3/4 of an inch. So if we run a line 3/4 of an inch up, just like that, and then from this side 3/4 of an inch like that, this will be the tenon now, or the mortise rather, that will accept the tenon from our stretcher. And we'll just double check our measurements to make sure that it is in accordance to what the plans say it should be, and it is. So we're going to go ahead now and mark all 4 legs for these tenons for the stretchers, making sure that we put it on the face side and not in the middle of a lamination. Well, now we've got all 4 of our mortises marked, and we've also transferred our center mark of each to the back of each one of the legs, and that's because we're going to have a hole to drill in there a little later. The next step that we want to do is we want to go ahead and mark the tenons at the top and the bottom of each one of these legs. So we're going to draw a line at 1.5 inches all the way around at the top and the bottom. And the reason we're only going to mark one leg is we're going to be using the miter fence at the table saw to cut these tenons. So once we get that set up with our stop blocks, there will be no need for the markings after that. We can just run them through almost like a production style to get them done. So let's go ahead and mark these, this top and bottom tenon, and then we're going to head over to the table saw. There are a lot of different ways to cut the tenons, and I used to have a tenon cutting jig for my rigid table saw, and I haven't gotten around to making one for the saw stop yet. So for me, I'm going to be using the dado blade for this. And you sort of have to be mindful of what you're doing here. So if this is the surface of the table saw, and this would be our board with the tenon cut, hopefully you can picture that. So this is our tenon right here. If this is a 2-inch tenon and this is a 2.5-inch board, this section right here and this section right here will be 1/4 of an inch each. So the dimension of your board, 2.5, minus the thickness of your tenon, will, at 2 inches, will give you 1/2 inch. You need half of that dimension on each side, so that's 1/4 inch and 1/4 inch. That will be the height of your dado blade. And then you can just set it up to cut your shoulder, and then from there, once you get your shoulders cut, then you can move your depth stop to continue on to the end of the board until you have it done. Now with these leg tenons, because they are 2 inches wide by 1.5 inches wide, you can't just cut this 1/4 inch height all the way around. So this is where I say to be mindful that you need to have two sides cut with that 1/2 inch, or sorry, that 1/4 inch height on the dado, but it's going to change on the opposite sides when you get down to the 1.5 inches. At that point in time, the height of the blade will be 1/2 inch, because that tenon, of course, will be 1.5 inches thick, and if it's 1.5 inches thick, take that away from the 2.5 inch board, that leaves you 1 inch divided by 2 is 1/2 inch. So then this dimension here and the height of the blade for the second section of the cut is going to be 1/2 inch. Did I just confuse everybody? I hope not. I've got the miter fence set up so that the edge of the cut is going to end up 1.5 inches in on this tenon, which is what we want according to the prints. I've also got it set up so that we've got 1/2 inch height on our dado blade. So if I trim off one side and then trim off the other, this is 2.5 inches thick, 1/2 inch off of this side, 1/2 inch off the other, I end up with 1.5 inch tenon in the middle. Then the other side is going to have to be 2 inch to give us 1.5 inches by 2. There's a reason that I'm doing the 1/2 inch first. And the reason for that is that it coincides with where my mortises are marked. If I run every first cut and I can see that mark for my mortise on the top on the first cut, the chances of me screwing it up are just a little less, because of course my first cut runs through, and then because the stop is set, I can just rotate this and do the other cut, and then all I have to do is rotate it 180 degrees and repeat the process. There's no way I can screw that up. As long as my first cut, I can see the mark for my mortise. I don't run the risk of accidentally cutting the wrong side. There's a second way to look at this, and that's that you could do the 1/4 inch height first, and if you screw it up, at least you can cut it again to the 1/2 inch height to correct it. But I'm going to throw caution into the wind and do the 1/2 inch cut first. And now with the second depth stop on the miter fence, we can go ahead and cut off this little shoulder that we've created here to complete that 1.5 inch wide section of the tenon. Well, now we've got our 1.5 inch width cut, and we need to cut the 1/4 inch off of the other two sides to make this the 2-inch wide tenon. And so I've got the dado blade set at a 1/4 inch, and you know, you can use all kinds of fancy gauges and digital things like what I normally like to use to set the height. But for this, all I did was scribe a line at a 1/4 inch across the board, sit it beside the blade, and then raise the height until it came to that line. You don't really need to go all fancy here, so that's what I've done. And now, because we haven't moved our depth stop, we can just place our boards in and cut these shoulders to get us the next length in our tenon, which is a 2-inch tenon on this side. And there's our tenons cut on the end of one leg. So now we're going to go ahead and cut all the rest of them to match. And then when I get that done, I'll come back and see you. Well, I've got all the tenons cut in the legs, and what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to get a block plane and run it across using the shoulder as a guide, and just clean these up and get them trimmed and fine-tune them so that they fit perfectly into the mortises that we cut earlier. But while I've got the dado blade set up in the saw, I'm going to go ahead and cut the tenons on the stretchers. And it's pretty much the same process with one exception. And I'll just show you that exception here once I get the long side of the tenon cuts. Well, we have the long edge of our tenons cut on our stretchers, and now we need this little short piece cut here. The way that I have this set up here, this is not the way to do it. This here is a good way to lose fingers. There just isn't enough stability in this board for my liking to run it through the table saw. So what I'm going to end up doing is actually attaching an auxiliary fence to my miter fence to give it a little bit more stability. Well, we've got the dry fit of the legs done, and now we're going to take it all apart and cut the mortises to accept the stretchers. The process to cut these mortises is exactly the same as we did in the rails, so we don't need another video of it, but just a quick recap. It'll be a Forstner bit to take out the majority of the material, and then finish it off with chisels and a mallet by hand, and then of course test fitting with the block plane and etc, etc, etc to get the mortises and the tenons to fit properly. I don't know if you remember, but when we marked these mortises, we also transferred the center mark to the back. And what that's for is a 5/8 diameter through hole that's going to accept some hardware. So we're going to drill that hole first before we start chewing away the material for the mortise. And I'll just show you what we're looking at here. There's our 5/8 of an inch diameter through hole, and on the other side are our 1-inch holes all the way along to chew out the majority of this material. Now we're going to go along in each one of these legs, and we're going to just take off these edges here with a 3/4 inch chisel. The old saying of measure twice, cut once apparently also applies to drilling. And one of these things doesn't belong here, and that would be this hole right here. One of the problems with having production type drilling like this is that if your one mark is off, well then that's where you're going to drill, and this is what happened here. I'm not going to worry too much about it. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, after all this work, I'm sure as heck not going to cut a new leg, laminate the whole 9 yards for one misdrilled hole. So for that I will be hitting the lathe, turning a 5/8 diameter plug, and I will be gluing it into this, trying to align the grain as best I can, trimming it flush, sanding it, and it'll look just as good as new. Hey, I make mistakes too. Well, all the mortises are cut in the legs, and the tenons are all straightened out and cleaned up on these stretchers, and they fit great. But there's one more hole to drill here, and that's on the stretchers. It's going to be a 1-inch diameter hole that's going to be centered 3 inches in from the edge here, and that's for yet another piece of hardware, and we're going to get into that hardware once we get the rails and the legs glued up. So I'm going to go ahead and mark those holes, drill them, and then we're going to carry on with gluing the rails and the legs together. And there it is, that 1-inch diameter hole. Now it's not a through hole, it's only 1 3/8 inch deep. That way it's not showing on the outsides of the board. But you may notice some chalk lettering here. That's just to help me keep track of a few pieces and what goes where. You know, tab A goes into slot B kind of thing. So it's up to you if you want to do that step. It does help you keep things in line. So now we'll go ahead and apply glue to the tenons of the legs, put them into the rail mortises, and clamp it up using some 4-foot bar clamps. At this point in time in the glue up, you want to make sure that everything is square. So get yourself one of your trusted squares in your shop and check all 4 corners, making sure that you're square at each. This is not the time to be out of whack on this, as this is going to support everything from here on in. Take measurements from corner to corner as well, and make sure that those measurements are the same. That'll ensure that everything is exactly square as well. And you want to be careful of winding, so make sure that this surface here is parallel and level with this surface up here. Well, the leg and rail assemblies are glued up and they're sitting in the bar clamps waiting to dry. While we're waiting on that, I've got the stretchers here. And what I'd like to do is this harsh edge here on the top and bottoms of the stretchers, I'm just going to go ahead with a trim router and a 1/4 inch roundover bit and just take that sharp edge off and make it a little softer of an edge. Well, I showed you how I screwed up. I might as well show you how I'm going to fix it. So what I've done is I've taken a scrap piece of maple and I've turned an ever so slightly tapered peg basically to the dimension that of the hole, which is 5/8 of an inch. I've glued it in place, and now we're just going to use this flush cut saw, and I'll cut it flush to the leg. And once we get this cut flush here, I'll sand it, and I guess it'll be a constant reminder on my bench to double check my measurements before I actually go ahead and either cut or, in this case, drill. The rails and the legs are glued up, and now you want to do a dry fit with the stringers. What I'm going to do is dry fit it and use strap clamps to hold it together for now. So now that the whole assembly is held together with straps, what you want to do is with a 5/8 drill bit, you want to run it through this 5/8 hole, extending into this 1-inch hole that we drilled earlier. And once you get that drilled, then you want to install the hardware. So I'll go ahead and drill this one through, and then I'll show you how the hardware attaches. So the way it works is we've got one of these little inset nuts, and that'll go inside of our 1-inch hole that we've drilled here. We've got a 5/8, it's actually a 1/2 inch diameter bolt now, that'll go through our 5/8 hole that we drilled earlier and thread into that inset nut. Once you get it threaded into the inset nut, you can just go ahead and take a 19 mil wrench and just give it a little bit of a crank down, and this will really help to pull the tenons in. Now you could have done this gluing it and pegging the mortise and tenon if you liked. But I really like the idea of if this ever loosens up, I can just come up along with the 19 mil wrench, give this a little torque, and it'll pull it all back in. So I'm going to go ahead and do the other 3 on the bench, and I'll come back. And with that, now the bench base is done. It needs a good sanding, and I'll go ahead and do that now. Take the hardware out of it to give it the sanding. But this is as far as we go with the base. And this is also as far as we go with this week's show, guys. So, thanks for joining me. I hope you're enjoying this video as much as I'm enjoying working on it. Next week, we're going to start in on the workbench top. And we've got some more lamination to do. It's going to be a great show, guys. Thanks for watching, and I'm going to see you again next week with yet another woodworking video.